Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to start first off with a thank you to people who have helped with the getting to this point in the presentation. Kate Grease has helped very much with the interviews that were collected that I'm reporting on today, and also to Bob Carpenter and Pauline Rochefort and Roland Kilpatrick for reviewing earlier copies of the instrument, the interview questions, and providing feedback, very valuable feedback on the interviews. So thank you to all those people. Sorry, I'm just gonna, there we go. Okay, so this is sort of a research presentation in a sense. It is not research. Okay, thank you. It is on? There we go. Thank you. Thank you. The show must go on, eh? The objectives of the monitoring program, because this, actually I forgot to thank a very important funder for this program, for the Biomass Innovation Center, the Go Green Community Fund. Provincial government provided some dollars to help us get this initiative up and running. And this monitoring project is part of delivering upon our objectives with them. So it's to understand the attitudes that potential buyers may have towards biomass, okay? And so that's compared to the fossil fuels, which is the dominant energy player, as well as to what's important to them. Oh, it doesn't legibly show up here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on a sort of a class lecture, but this gives you a bit of understanding of where I'm coming from and an understanding of attitudes. There's three pieces of attitudes: the beliefs, the cognition piece, which is that first circle, which is not too legible. The second piece is the affect. That's the emotion or the evaluations that people form about products. Okay? And then the last circle is the conation, or the actual actions, the intended actions that people have. So that's the third piece of attitudes. Okay? When we're dealing with organizational buyers, we look at groups of people, right? Much like a family would. Not necessarily individual consumers, but as a family. So we have multiple people getting together to decide how they should be making this purchase for the organization, okay? So multiple people, they may be engaging in multiple roles, different roles. And those roles include, they may be the user of the product, in this case a heating system. They may be influencers and having some sort of impact on the actual decision. They may be the actual buyers who go through the process of buying the system. They may be making the decision, or they may be the gatekeepers. They may be controlling the information that gets into the buying center. Okay, these are the different roles. Maybe one or two people, or maybe 6, 7, 8. It depends on the organization. When it comes to the biomass, the situational impact is typically a new buy is what we are expecting. We realize that heating systems are not necessarily a new buy, but because the system is very different, or perceived to be very different, we're expecting it to be treated like a new buy, to have more people involved, technical, operational people involved in the buying center, as well as having a long cycle time. Okay. So just a brief comment on methodology. We conducted direct interviews with people in the region of a key segment in municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. And we engaged in about 50 of these directed interviews, as well as an online, to try to get a broader perspective outside the region, which we received much less response rate on. So we ended up with a very small, relatively small sample of 62. But remember, this is a very targeted segment. We're dealing with professionals, organizational buyers, and it's fairly typical to only get, or to have small samples to deal with. So that's not such a concern. But what is of particular interest is that these people will be more likely to enter in the dialogue on this new biomass heating system. So it's a relatively small sample, but a very key and targeted one. So in terms of familiarity with the different heating sources, so how much knowledge do you have about the different heating sources? Hydro, of course, is the highest rating for familiarity, so that's not a huge surprise given it's a fairly long-standing source of power in this region. Solar and wind as the green alternatives. coming up as the next one, or 2 and 3, and that echoes some previous work by Aguilar in the Energy Policy Journal that showed that wood-based energy is less preferred than solar and wind, and this preference may in fact come from levels of familiarity. Okay, so as people become more familiar with biomass, the author of that study acknowledged that biomass and wood-based energy will improve. The other important note here is that biomass is a geothermal biofuel. Although not significantly different from the midpoint, an individual paired test shows that biomass is significantly different from biofuel. So familiarity with biomass is higher than biofuel. And that's important because that's an important distinction to make. Biofuel has come under criticism for its at least agriculturally based biofuel, as taking away arable land for energy and increasing prices for food and contributing to a global food shortage. So that's something biomass does not have, and that's an important advantage. So the views of biomass, these are the actual attributes. When I talked a bit before about the 3 components of attitudes, it's a multi-attribute model, meaning there's a lot of different characteristics that people consider. There's a lot of different beliefs. There's some evaluations and some actual actions afterwards, right? So in the strengths, it's hard to read the slide. I apologize for that. But this column here, these items on this side, are the strengths. So the ratings, the attributes that were rated quite highly: supply chain, fuel shortage, and knowledge about, so familiarity being one of the largest weaknesses. Okay. An important part too is you'll see in a few moments some of these items come through. The strengths, comfort, efficiency, safety, regulatory compliance are also very important for buyers. Okay. And the environmental impact, emissions, and sustainability of fuel supply are an advantage for biomass when compared to fossil fuels. So those are important strengths. And here's the advantages over fossil fuels. So I'm doing a gap analysis here on the ratings of biomass energy compared to fossil fuels. Okay? So what you're seeing here is an average score of 3.52 for biomass on emissions versus 2.82 fossil fuels, and that's a significant difference. It's a fairly large gap. And so we have significant differences with emissions, environmental impact. The environmental considerations, biomass is seen to have an advantage, okay? So that's probably not a huge surprise to everybody. But what's very interesting here, and although not significant in the statistical sense, directionally it's showing that fuel cost and local economic impact, so the economic component is coming through. And then the last 2 items here that have difference, at least nominally, is community interest and stakeholder values. So a social dimension, okay? So we have environment, we have economic, and social. Those are the 3 parts of a triple bottom line story. So from a sustainable management perspective, and that's huge, that's important. So while it's not significant, there's some direction here, and it may be the path of least resistance for forming an overall image of biomass. Now, there was some insignificance with the advantages of biomass over fossil fuels, but people seem to be not too shy about telling us about the disadvantages, right, or perceived disadvantages. So these are all significant. And we end up with some items down here that are also weaknesses, so things like knowledge about the familiarity issue, fuel storage, ease of maintenance, and established supply chain are also weaknesses that we saw in the previous slide. Okay, so this is something that really fossil fuel has an advantage over biomass. So we've looked at biomass views on their own for the strength. We've looked at comparing it against the fossil fuels, and now I want to take a look at the items that are most important to buyers. Okay, and so to do this, I'm presenting a grid, which apparently this soft blue doesn't show up very well on this projector. But these are the top 10 importance attributes, or the top 10 characteristics that are most important. Okay, and so the vertical line is this high importance down to low importance, whereas the horizontal is the low performance to high performance. And this isn't an absolute in the sense that 0 is the center point. This is a relative rating. So I'm using the averages for each of these responses. So the importance average was 4.2 on a 5-point scale, and the performance of biomass was 3.35 as an average. Okay? So even in the sense of these that are just on the side of the divider, they may be showing as low performers, they're still slightly positive. Okay, so there's a bit of a small story, positive story there. But the area of focus is really this grid on the right. Right? So comfort is a high importance item where biomass seems to be performing perceived well as safety, efficiency, reliability, regulatory compliance, and fuel cost. Okay, so these are important considerations, and they're considerations that biomass does very well on. So in a sense, we come to this conclusion or this notion that an image has to be formed about biomass. At least that's from my perspective. I'm a marketer. This is how I think. So the attitudes or the images are not they are not crystallized. They're not strongly held beliefs. Right? These are weakly held images we've seen from the familiarity items. So something has to be done to set biomass's image. Okay? And so when you're talking about attitude change, you usually look at 3 different things. You look at changing the perceptions on important attributes, you look at changing the importance of specific attributes, or you look at changing perceptions about your competitor, in this case fossil fuels. Well, it probably makes most sense to look at biomass. It's sort of the path of least resistance because of the low levels of familiarity. And so things need to be focused on, and the focus should be placed on 3 things. First is the advantages that I mentioned. That triple bottom line story directionally is there, and that's a huge advantage compared to fossil fuels. So think about the environmental considerations, which are already acknowledged and well known by the buying center respondents, but also considering the economic and the social. So the second point is that communication plans should emphasize the areas of high importance where biomass performs well. Okay, so these are the important considerations where biomass is seen to be doing well. So that's comfort, efficiency, safety, and regulatory compliance. Those pieces should be messages or part of the messages. And finally, there should be something to do with the issues of performance. So those relatively weaker performers, where there is consideration or they're considered to be high important characteristics, but biomass is not doing so well, something needs to be done there. Whether it's actual fixing of a substantive underlying problem, which may be the case and maybe should be dealt with, or maybe it's just a communication issue. Okay. And also, of course, if you ask an academic what to do, there's always more research, right? We tend to raise more questions than we do answers. So there's a whole bunch of more that needs to be done. So we need to understand more at a national or provincial level, as this research focused mostly on the region. We need to understand consumer attitudes as well. We focused on organizational buyers, but have not looked at consumers. And the impact of different communication approaches, as well as understanding the upstream influence. So these are things like suppliers, other stakeholders like insurance, what are their attitudes towards it. So there's some very important areas that need further work, and on that, I see I've got the red flag, so I must pass the torch. Thank you very much.